Alrighty guys, so I'm going to walk you through the Telltale Heart fairly quickly because I have a video that I want you to watch, a video interpretation of it. It is an incredible story which I'm sure you've heard of before. The Telltale Heart, basically the central conflict in here is on the focus of madness. So like most Poe stories, the central figure, the narrator, technically our protagonist, is the murderer. He begins by telling us straightforward that he plans on murdering the old man that he takes care of because, as he says, not because the man has been bad to him. He says he values him as a father figure. He's always been good to him. He's never said an ill word. He has a great affinity for him, but the man has an eye which is sort of glazed over, has a white film on it, and he can never see where it's looking, and so it drives him literally mad, to the point that he's decided he's going to murder the old man so he can get rid of the eye once and for all. It's pretty gruesome. But the central discussion is on the concept of madness. And he tells us over and over and over again, I am not mad. You will say I am mad, but I am not mad. Would a mad person be able to reasonably think through all the steps you had to do? So it's kind of in a weird way kind of funny if you think about it, because the more he insists that he's not mad, the madder he seems. Or crazy, or whatever word you want to use, but madness is the word that Poe always relies on. So at the top of 692 he says, you fancy me mad, madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me, you should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. So he's saying, you think I'm crazy, but you should have seen me. I was planning this for days and days and months. He says he goes into the old man's room every night for 7 days, trying to get up the nerve to do it, if you will. And every time he draws back, and he says, you have never treated the man so kind as I did in the week before his death, as if this is supposed to be somehow making it okay, or somehow it's rationalizing. And so Poe is showing us how rational analysis doesn't work. Remember, rational analysis is what is in the Enlightenment, and here rational analysis is an element of madness. So it is an element of irrationality, and that's what's fascinating about what Poe does here. So we move from visual, so the element of the eye and how mad it drives him, to sound. And so we have the final night. He goes into the old man's room, and he says he opens the door, and the beam of light falls upon the old man's eye, almost as if by fate. It's illuminating the object of his need to destroy. So he says the old man sits up, and he has a moment where he says, who's there? And we assume the old man is blind, so he can't see. And Poe's narrator says he saw it precisely on the damned spot. Now, if you're thinking illusions and you think Shakespeare, does that recall any Shakespearean text to you? The answer, of course, is Lady Macbeth, the out damn spot speech, where she says out, damn spot, and she's literally going mad trying to get the blood out of her hands after she's killed, I think it's Banquo. Sorry, it's been a while since I've read Macbeth. So we have a direct literary allusion to death, murder, madness, all of these together. And that's on page 693, right in the middle. So he says he hears a sound, and it's the beating of the old man's heart. So now we have this new element. And the poor old guy, his heart is going faster and faster and faster, and he can hear it louder and louder and louder. And it goes to the point where he's trying to get up the courage to do it, and he's listening to the heartbeat, and it's getting louder and louder and louder. He says it's to the point that he thinks that a neighbor is going to hear the old man's heartbeat, so he has to act. And with that, he jumps on the man, he pulls him off the bed, and then smothers him with the mattress until he can no longer hear. He sits there listening to the old man's heartbeat just get slower and slower and slower until finally there's no more heartbeat. And then he feels this sense of relief like he's never felt before. And he says, if you will still think me mad, on the page of 694, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. So again, we have this rational thinking. He starts, this is gruesome, but he starts cutting up the body, so he dismembers it. and he puts all the pieces into the floorboard. He thought about putting it in a grave. He thought about digging a grave in the cellar. But no, he's too smart for that. So he digs up the floorboard, puts all of the man's parts in there, and then closes it up. And so he says that the police come by because a neighbor heard a scream and they called the police. So he says, but what had I to fear from them? I smiled. I bade them welcome. So here he's cool as a cucumber because he thinks his problems are all solved. The man's heartbeat is gone, the eye is gone, everything's great. So he leads them around all confidently, and they're sitting there talking to him. And he says, at length, I heard this ringing, and it becomes more and more distinct as they're talking. So he's starting to lose his coolness just a little bit. And he says, I had to get rid of that feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. So at this point, he's 100% convinced that the noise is not in his mind, it's coming from somewhere else. And he realizes it. He says, I grew very pale. I realized it much as a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. So the sound of the man's heartbeat under the mattress, right? He could hear it more and more and more, and it was the heartbeat of the man. And he says, I knew they suspected, they could see me, they could see it in my face. And it just builds and builds and builds, and he gets more and more fidgety as he's sitting there talking to the police, to the point that he can't take it, and he bursts out, and he says, they knew, they suspected, they had to have known, they were making a mockery of my horror, so the horror at the sound of the heartbeat, they could hear it too. Says, anything is better than this agony, anything was more tolerable than this derision, so he thinks at this point, he thinks they're mocking him by ignoring the heartbeat that clearly everybody hears. So again, we return to this madness, and we see that it is in fact, I think that it is in fact madness. Now, other people like to argue that it isn't madness, and that he has been rational the entire time, and this is just a manifestation of his guilt. And that's one of the central arguments about this text. It's why it's so much fun to talk about. So he says it gets louder and louder and louder, and you see this exclamation points in the italics. And he says, villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed, tear up the planks. And you imagine him tearing up the planks, clawing at it. Here is the beating of his hideous heart. And that's the end of the story. So I've had students ask me, how do I get engaged in these texts? Some of the texts are I just can't get excited about them. If you can read it the way that I just did, where you can really see it in your mind, you can hear the sounds, you can think of sort of the character's mindset, that's going to really help you get into these stories. Poe is not hard to get into. Poe is fascinating, terrifying writer. He's incredibly skilled, and that's why he's beloved. So I encourage you to kind of put that mentality, that emphasis, that energy into the stories that you read. So in order to really understand and get this story, if you've never read it, I ask that you go now and watch the YouTube video that's below. It's an older version. It's not good quality, but it is the closest version to the original text that I could find. And it's incredibly effective, actually, at the end. The black and white does something that's really cool. So enjoy, really immerse yourself in these stories, and then move on to the next activity.